You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have the very patient Eric Klein, PhD. Patient because our schedule changed quite a bit, but he still made it to the podcast, so I thank him for that. He's a professor of classics, history, and anthropology at GW Capital Archaeological Institute, part of George Washington University. And we're going to talk about the year 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. So I think this is going to be a very interesting podcast, and welcome, Eric.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, if you would. It seems like you have your finger in a lot of pies in terms of your background, your current position. What got you into the study of, ancient history, and, what's a little bit about your background before we get started?
Yeah, so complicated and yet simple. Always wanted to be an archaeologist since the age of 7 when my mother gave me a book about ancient Troy and the Trojan War, and I announced I was going to be an archaeologist, and lo and behold, half a century later, here I am. But my specialty is late Bronze Age, so think between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago, time of the Trojan War, and over in the Aegean and the ancient Near East. So everything from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia, like 3,200 years ago. And that's what I do. And I'm an active field archaeologist, as in I go out and get dirty every summer. I've been on, I think, 30 seasons of excavations by this point in places ranging from Greece to Egypt to Jordan to Israel to the United States. So that's me basically in a nutshell.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
if you
it's
would,
fun.
a couple questions on being out in the field. What are some misconceptions people have about it? And, what are some of the things that are really fun or like just deadly boring or tiresome or difficult about it?
Well, first and foremost, if you've seen the Indiana Jones movies, it's nothing like that. We don't have whips. Most of us do not wear fedoras. We almost never run from rolling boulders, anything like that. And at this age, most of us belong in museums. But so that's an inside joke if you've seen the movies.
Yeah.
It is a lot more difficult than people think. It's a lot more physical. We don't usually excavate using dental tools and toothbrushes, which is the general, popular vision. We're actually out there working with big tools, pickaxes, shovels, little hand tools, and are digging pretty quickly. It's only when we get to very detailed stuff like, skeletons or something that we switch over to dental tools and toothbrushes. But it's, I think, one of the most interesting professions. When you go out each morning, you have literally no idea what you're going to find that day. It may be completely mundane, hundreds of broken potsherds, or you could stumble upon something that could change our knowledge of the site or the region or human history. Who knows? So always something new to be doing.
It sounds like a combination of ditch digging and like desert gardening.
It is to a certain extent. When I get people on our excavation that have never dug before, which is very common, most people have never been on a dig before they come with us. And I say the first day, look, I'm going to teach you how to dig. And I say, how many of you have done gardening back home? And of course, most of them raise their hands. And I say, great, this is pretty much the same thing, except instead of pulling weeds, you're going to be looking at things that people haven't touched in a couple thousand years. But, the basic idea of digging is the same. Just do it carefully, and we'll be watching you and ask us if you, think you found something, and we go from there. So yeah, a combination of gardening and ditch digging would be one way to put it.
Okay. Yeah, I remember when I was little, like digging in my backyard, and sometimes I'd find stuff, and I didn't find anything remarkable that I saw, but sometimes you'd find maybe a boot or a rusty nail or something like that. It was really interesting and fascinating to find that stuff. It's weird.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're just in your backyard, who knows? I mean, it depends where you are living, but broken pieces of glass from 100 years ago, whatever. Basically, their garbage is now our artifacts. So getting your start in your backyard is a good way to begin.
Okay. What caused you to look at the year 1177 BC? What was the context of what was going on and where?
All right. So my specialty, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the late Bronze Age, say 1700 BC to 1200 BC. This is a time period that actually people are more aware of than they think they are. People go, oh, I don't know the late Bronze Age, but you actually do, because this is the time period of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty. Wager a guess that many of your lecture listeners have heard of King Tut, for example. So this is the time period. You've got King Tut, you've got Ramses II, you've got Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, and so on. In addition to the Egyptian 18th dynasty, this is also the time period of the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece. Think Trojan War, right, where the Mycenaeans go off to fight the Trojans. It's the time of the Minoans on Crete, again, which many people have heard of. You've got the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, for example, the half-man, half-bull living underneath the palace. But it's also the time of other civilizations that people might not have heard about, like the Hittites in ancient Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, such as the Assyrians and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia, basically today's modern Iraq. Also the time period of the Canaanites up and down the Levant, what is today modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and that region. And this is pre-Israelites, if you want to put it that way. So it's the Bronze Age cultures that were there before, say, the time of the Exodus. So that period, the late Bronze Age, is my specialty. It's the time when they were using tin and copper to make bronze. Bronze Age had actually started back about 3000 BC. We're now in the last part of that period, just before they changed to the Iron Age. And they had been happily interacting. There's about 8 societies at that time, the ones that I mentioned, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Egyptians, and so on. And they had been happily interacting in kind of a globalized network stretching across the Mediterranean that was up and running happily for about 500 years, very similar to ours in many ways, which might be surprising. Lots of marriages, lots of divorces, people leaning on each other for raw materials like tin, copper, silver, gold, but also finished product that they're sending back and forth, textiles, and so on. And as I say, they've been happily flourishing for about 500 years until suddenly, round about the year 1177, everything came crashing down. Everything that they had had in place fell apart. The stabilized, globalized network fell apart, and life, basically as they knew it, came to a screeching halt. Now, this is, I would say, equivalent to the fall of the Roman Empire, which everybody's heard of. But this collapse, the collapse of the late Bronze Age, very few people outside of academia have ever heard about it. And yet it was completely consequential for that time period. Every one of the societies was affected to one degree or another. The problem is, and this is why it's one of history's great mysteries, is that we do not know what caused the collapse. So,
well, first, we're going to move forward. Or do you look at what you find through also the lens of what's spoken about in the Bible, or do you look at it just from the completely secular point of view?
This is a very good question. I would try to look at it through the lens of the Bible to a certain extent. I treat it as I would any other ancient source. So I guess that would be secular rather than religious. The problem is a lot of the stuff from the second millennium BC that we're talking about is not verifiable. And I include there things like the patriarchs, Moses, the Exodus. Did any of that actually happen? That is surprisingly difficult to find in the archaeological record. So I do mention it in the book 1177 BC. I mentioned the Exodus, for example, and I do think the timing for the Exodus works extremely well during this period of the collapse, but it's very hard to find any evidence for it. In the first millennium, when we've got the period of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians, that period we've got external corroboration, what we call extra-biblical. We've got Neo-Assyrian inscriptions and so on. So we know, for example, that kings like Ahab and Jehu did exist because they're not just in the Bible, they're also mentioned by the Neo-Assyrians. But, David, we didn't have any evidence for David until 1992, when an inscription was found at the site of Tel Dan in the north of Israel, mentioning Beit David, the house of David. We still don't have any evidence that Solomon actually existed. And, this is the vagaries of archaeology. We are at the mercy of what we find. So until we find something, it's not corroborated, I would say. from my point of view, as trained ancient historian and archaeologist, I will not believe something conclusively until it's corroborated by 3 independent sources of evidence. So a mention of the Bible would be one, a mention in, say, a Neo-Assyrian inscription would be another, and archaeology would be the third. So, the Neo-Assyrian conquest of Samaria and the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, not a problem. 720, we've got all 3. We've got the Bible, we've got extra-biblical, we've got archaeological. But for back in the second millennium, which is the topic of the 1177 book, surprisingly little corroboration. Again, I would say it's the accident of archaeology. In the sequel to the book, which just came out called After 1177, they're much firmer ground in terms of using the Bible as one of the ancient sources because we've got this corroboration. So, as ancient historians and archaeologists, we have to deal with what we're dealt with. But again, and going back to why I like archaeology, it can change. It can turn on a dime depending on who finds what out in the field, each summer. So 1177 uses a bit of the Bible, but not as much as the sequel does.
Okay. I understand. It makes total sense what you're saying. What was going on in and around 1177? What's your theory on what was happening and what would have caused this collapse?
Right. So that's beginning and ending of this book, 1177, was what caused the collapse. The middle part is informing people about these societies and what collapsed. Right? It's an introduction to Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Canaanites, and all of that.
I guess, actually, first, how large of a geographic area do you suddenly see an absence of activity in 1177? Is it a very large area, or is it only certain peoples? What's the extent of this collapse?
In modern terms, it's from Italy on the west over to Iran and Iraq and even Afghanistan on the east, and from Turkey down to Egypt from north to south. So basically from the western Mediterranean all the way over to the Tigris and Euphrates. It's a big area. Yeah. Absolutely big area. And again, there are 8 different societies in that region that are affected.
And again, I know you're not relying on it. It's only a third, but in terms of the people spoken of in the Bible, in the Old Testament, does it seem to encompass all of them that had written anything that was in the Bible, or were there other peoples that maybe have been mentioned that were outside that region?
Well, I would phrase it a slightly different way because, for instance, some of the people that are mentioned were a bit of a surprise. All right, let me give you just one example and then we'll move on. The Hittites are mentioned in the Bible. right? And compare, in relation to Abraham and others. The Hittites are mentioned again and again. In fact, David even sends Bathsheba's first husband, Uriah the Hittite, sends him off to the front lines to get killed. We had always thought that the Hittites would be somewhere down in, what is today modern-day Israel, Syria, something like that, Lebanon. Turns out that the ancient Hittites were actually up in what we now call Turkey, ancient Anatolia. And nobody had been looking for them up there. They had been finding in the 1800s archaeological ruins of a people they didn't know about. And then one archaeologist, linguist, epigrapher, Archibald Henry Sayce, in the 1800s announced that the ruins they were finding up in Turkey were in fact the remnants of the Hittites. And he was correct. And so then the question becomes, how did the Bible get it so wrong that the Hittites are not down, in essentially modern-day Israel, but are up in Turkey? Turns out that during this collapse, the one we're talking about, 1177 BC, the Hittites are one of the societies that are affected most dramatically, such that their society goes away. There is nobody that really calls themselves a Hittite in Central Anatolia anymore. Their economy goes away, the palatial society goes away, the king goes away. What survives are areas that they had conquered in northern Syria, which did manage to survive the collapse and formed what we call Neo-Hittite societies, little city-states, which are being excavated even as we speak.
Was this then, instead of a diaspora, was it a concentration to the center of certain societies, or was this a diaspora? This is very strange so far.
So a diaspora of the Hittites? No, the Hittites...
No, a diaspora, like a geographic diaspora. So this huge region was affected, it looks like. Did the peoples move outwards from that region even further out, and you find evidence of them there? Or was it, again, there this disaster and also like a consolidation of people towards maybe the geometric center of the area? Does it look like either of those two things?
They're migrating around within this area. So they're not necessarily going outside, but they are going from one place to another. So, for instance, and again, I can tie this in and bring it full circle. One of the things that I was taught back in undergraduate and then graduate school was that the collapse had been caused by an invasion, a migration of a group that we call the Sea Peoples. And the Sea Peoples seem to have migrated from the Western Mediterranean over to the Eastern Mediterranean, probably because of a drought. Now, it turns out that when they got to the Eastern Mediterranean, that is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, the drought was there as well. So they literally went from the frying pan into the fire, I think is the saying. And they found people already there, so they invaded. And we get the story from the Egyptians who say that they fought this disparate group, the Sea Peoples, which are actually 9 separate groups. They fought them twice. They fought them once in 1207 BC and once in 1177 BC. But we know from the archaeology that this group, the Sea Peoples, came across by land and in fact came on down through Turkey, down into Syria, Lebanon, Israel, winding up in Egypt. So they actually came through the region in North Syria that the Hittites had been holding on to, and that you now have these Neo-Hittites living. And by the way, those Neo-Hittites are the ones that the Bible knows. The Bible doesn't know about the original Hittites up in Anatolia. They do know the Neo-Hittites that are in northern Syria, and they're going to be interacting with them. So it's not that the Bible has it wrong, it's that they're reporting on where the Hittites are in the first millennium, but these are the new Hittites. So the Sea Peoples, they came down, also settle down and assimilate. And in fact, there's some new evidence from the site of Ashkelon in southern modern Israel, where a Philistine cemetery and settlement was excavated, and they found a number of interments and graves, if you will, including some infants that were underneath the floor, and they were able to extract the DNA. And these little kids, there are 4 little kids, date from about 1100 BC, give or take, and they seem to be half local Canaanite and half other. And when you run the computer models for the DNA, it says that other is probably from Crete or Sicily, Spain, Sardinia, somewhere in that region. So this would be, I would say, support for the Sea Peoples having come and settled down. Why is this of interest? Well, the Sea Peoples is our name for them. It's actually what the French Egyptologists called them. But the Egyptians tell us their specific names, and there are 9 different groups that the Egyptians say invaded at that time period. Some, like the Shardana, we think maybe they're Sardinia. Shekelesh, maybe Sicily. The only one we know for sure is a group called the Peleset, and we think the Peleset are the Philistines. And of course, the Philistines are in the Bible, become the mortal enemy of David and the Israelites and all of that. So it looks like the Peleset become the Philistines when they settle down during the late Bronze Age collapse and into its aftermath. But what it turns out is that, yes, the Sea Peoples are part of the equation, but they're not the only reason. I mentioned that they may have started migrating because of a drought. We've got more and more and more and more evidence over the last 10, 12 years of a drought that lasted between 150 and 300 years, from about 1200 BC all the way down to 900 BC, and in a region covering what we're talking about, from Italy over to Iran and from Turkey down to Egypt. We've got scientific evidence for a drought from lake sediments, from caves, including the stalagmites, and so on. It's just, the evidence is overwhelming now that there is a major drought.
300 years?
Yeah, you talk about a mega drought. Can you imagine that? 300 years? Yeah.
I'm sure drought doesn't mean no water, but probably a lot less than they were used to. But that would destroy any society. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, it would definitely impact it. And our scientific advances are getting good enough that we can actually see upticks from time to time, like a 50-year period where things got slightly better. And in fact, Daphne Langut, a researcher at Tel Aviv University, has it's now shown that there's an increase in rainfall again, somewhere about 1100 BC down to about 950 BC. And she says that would have allowed them to start planting things like olives again. And of course, that dovetails with the establishment of the United Monarchy and then the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, but also other kingdoms in the area like Ammon and Edom and Moab. So she's able now to point and say, okay, there is, sometimes where it gets slightly better before it gets worse again. So it's a really interesting period back then and also an interesting period now to be studying this. So, and along with the drought, you can probably guess what comes with it, right? You've got drought. That means you've got famine, people starving. And we know that's happening because we have textual records from that time period in which they say, everyone here is starving. We need grain. Please send us help and so on. We also have evidence for disease, right? Think 10 plagues with the Exodus. Also, in the first book of the Iliad, Homer talks about plague with the Mycenaeans, but we actually have archaeological evidence for one of the Egyptian pharaohs, for example. I think it's Ramses V in about 1140. He's got smallpox, and he and many of his family died from it. So you've got drought, famine, disease, invaders, migrants, the sea peoples, and, also just to add insult to injury, earthquakes, series of earthquakes during this time period. So my conclusion in the book is that it's not any one driver or stressor. It's not just drought. It's not just famine. It's not just earthquakes. It's all of them. I think they happened in rapid succession, that it was a perfect storm of catastrophes, and it happened so quickly that you couldn't recover from one before the next one hits. I mean, think about it logically. When an earthquake hits, a lot of people die, but it doesn't destroy your society. You pick up and you keep going. Same thing with famine, same thing with disease. I mean, look at COVID-19, right? Well, we have continued on despite how traumatic it was. But what happens if they're all at the same time or one after another? If you've got one, okay, you can survive. If you have two, okay, maybe you can survive. By the time you get to number 3 or number 4, you throw up your hands, you say, Dayenu, enough, right? And then that's it. Your society is impacted, and it depends on how resilient you are and how much you've planned for the future, whether you're going to make it through this collapse. So in the first book, 1177, I talk about all these factors and the actual archaeological and textual evidence that we have for it. And then in the sequel, after 1177, which just came out, I talk about basically the 8 case studies of what to do and what not to do if you're impacted by such a catastrophe. So in the separate chapters, I say, look, what happened to the Hittites? What happened to the Assyrians? What happened to the Egyptians? What happened to the Mycenaeans? And so on. And then at the end of this new sequel, I ask how much of this is relevant to us today. And my conclusion, you won't be surprised, is that it is extremely relevant to us today because most of the things that contributed to their collapse, we've got around today. And I personally am a little bit concerned that history is going to repeat itself and that we're going to find ourselves going down that slippery slope to collapse. And then we're going to have to figure out how resilient are we going to be.
What are the analogs that you're seeing today? Where specifically are they concentrated?
Yeah, they're all over the place, but I'm seeing climate change. I don't think you can argue against that all around the world. I'm seeing things like the pandemic, COVID. I'm seeing things like dramatic wildfires in California and in Greece and elsewhere. I have a list at the end of the lecture that I give here where I ask each one. I'm like, drought? Yes. Famine? Yes. Migrants? Yes. Disease? Yes. I think we've got pretty much everything around today that they had back then. And I would actually say that looking back, I think we're pretty lucky that the financial collapse of 2008 didn't happen 10 or 12 years later. Imagine if we had had the meltdown on Wall Street at the same time as the pandemic and the wildfires and all that. I think we'd already be down there looking, up going, what the heck happened to us?
So right after the Bronze Age was what, the Iron Age?
Yeah. So this is what happens. One of the things that I talk about in the sequel is there is something called the adaptive cycle, which environmentalists and sociologists and others like talk about. Basically, it's, empires rise, empires fall, right? Everything has its day, then something new comes along. And there is a period in this adaptive cycle, which looks like a figure 8 on its side, where things collapse and then they have to basically regenerate and start again. And that's what the Iron Age is. After the collapse, after 1177, people have to figure out how to adapt to the new normal. And again, do you just adapt, which means, you're living for today or tomorrow? Do you just cope with it? Or do you transform, which is the best thing that you can do? But transforming means you need to be innovative and you need to be inventive. And if you're really good at it, you can flourish in that age of chaos. And that's where iron comes in, because as far as we can tell, they were having supply chain issues back then. Again, sounds familiar. And they may have been having trouble getting tin, which was mostly coming all the way from Afghanistan, which is, a very long trade route to get to the Mediterranean and then to Greece. And if those trade routes were cut at any time and you couldn't get tin, then you can't make bronze, right? A real problem. So if there were shortages like that or anything else affecting the supply chain, they would have had to be inventive and innovative. And that's where iron comes in. It looks like the people on Cyprus, which is where most of the copper came from in the Bronze Age, they may have accidentally been discovering how to smelt iron during the Bronze Age, but not using it. But now, when they had to, they pivoted. And instead of just producing copper and bronze, they seem to be at the forefront of this new technology of smelting iron. And it turns out, of course, that iron is better for holding an edge and everything else in terms of not just weapons, but also tools. And so the Cypriots, they flourish in this age of chaos and they start exporting new objects made out of iron, but they're also really nice about it. They seem to export the know-how, the technology, along with the actual items. And they send them both to Greece on one side and to the Levant on the other. And when they export the technology, well, everyone's got iron ore in their country. So as soon as everybody knew how to smelt iron, they were off and running. And so, yes, we get an Iron Age at this point. So the Cypriots actually come through better than almost anybody. The only people that rival them for doing really well are the group that we call the Phoenicians. Phoenicians in what are now modern Lebanon. They didn't call themselves Phoenicians. Later Greeks did that. But they're from cities that are still around today. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Byblos, and so on. And they're the ones that standardized the alphabet at this time and spread it around the Mediterranean along with purple dye. So those two, the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, in the Iron Age do better than anybody else. They're anti-fragile, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb has said, that flourishing in an age of chaos. Like I said, other groups like the Hittites, they don't make the cut at all, and they disappear. Same thing with the Mycenaeans, and so on. Egyptians do kind of so-so. They don't disappear, but they're not as big on the world scene afterward as they had been. But, the other thing that this does in the Iron Age is open up the door to new groups and new people. And the empires and the kingdoms of the Bronze Age have disappeared. Now, in the Iron Age, after 1200 BC, we get new, smaller city-states and kingdoms like the ones I've already mentioned. In the aftermath of the collapse is when we get the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, Edom, Ammon, Moab. Up in Turkey, we get groups like the Urartians and the Phrygians. Over in Greece, they have to start from scratch, but we're pretty quickly, within a couple hundred years, going to get back up to speed there too, to archaic Greece and then classical Greece, which is where we get democracy and the Parthenon and so on. So it is a huge catastrophe at 1177 BC. They have to rebuild from it, but in rebuilding, they created basically the world that we've got today. What it led directly to us. So,
it's really interesting that this catastrophe is what did it. It's what ushered in the Iron Age and many other things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I say that collapse is, first of all, the catastrophe that nobody outside of academia has ever heard of. But secondly, why it is just as important as the collapse and fall of the Roman Empire, right? It was dramatic, it was catastrophic, and it had ripple effects that went down through the centuries. So one of my goals is to make this catastrophe known to the general public. Not only is it my favorite period, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, but I also think it's one of the most interesting, and I find that most people have never heard of it. So it's basically, come gather around the campfire. Let me tell you the stories of what happened that you're not aware of.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. We're trying to reach a new audience now. The original book, the one we've been talking about, 1177, came out 10 years ago in 2014. But so much new data was found by archaeologists and scientists that I asked and was given permission to put out a revised edition in 2021. It came out during the pandemic. So if anybody's going to go buy the book, get the revised edition from 2021. And then on the same day that the sequel came out in 2024, because I had already been working on it, we also put out a graphic version of the original. So, for those people that don't like to read books, but like comic books and such, there is now a 250-page full-color comic book of the original book, The Collapse, which is, I think, absolutely gorgeous. Glynis Fox, who's an archaeologist and a cartoonist, drew it. I was working with her on it, and we're hoping it reaches a whole new market, not only like kids, 7 to 17, but older adults who prefer to read, graphic version. So I'm very excited by that. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Okay. Well, very good. Yeah, it was very fascinating. I was joking with you. We were offline, sadly. I hope your next book is not the collapse of 2025, but we may be headed there. We'll see.
There was a time during the pandemic where I'm thinking, all right, we're already repeating it, but yeah, hopefully there won't be a third book based on today, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, very good. So in addition to getting the latest version of your book, make sure they do that. Where can people find out more about your work?
So they can just basically Google me, Eric H. Klein, Cline, and I'll come up, and there's a couple of different websites. I think ehklein.com is still up and running. There's also my university website at George Washington University. But I'm pretty easy to find. I'm also active on social media. I'm on Facebook. I'm on X/Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads. So there, my handle is Dig Cabri, Digkabri. Cabri is the name of the site that I'm excavating these days when we're back in the field. So just do a search for either my full name or Dig Cabri, and you should be able to find me pretty easily.
Well, very good. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a really great call, and I appreciate you being here.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.